A leaf is an organ of a vascular plant and is the principal lateral appendage of the stem. The leaves and stem together form the shoot. Foliage is a mass noun that refers to leaves collectively. Typically a leaf is a thin, dorsiventrally flattened organ, borne above ground and specialized for photosynthesis. In most leaves, the primary photosynthetic tissue, the, is located on the upper side of the blade or lamina of the leaf, but in some species, including the mature foliage of Eucalyptus palisade, mesophyll is present on both sides and the leaves are said to be isobilateral. Most leaves have distinctive upper and lower surfaces that differ in color, hairiness, the number of stomata, epicuticular wax amount and structure and other features. Broad, flat leaves with complex venation are known as megaphylls, and the species that bear them, the majority, as broad-leaved or megaphylous plants. In others, such as the club mosses, with different evolutionary origins, the leaves are simple, with only a single vein and are known as microphylls. Some leaves, such as bulbs calyz, are not above ground, and in many aquatic species the leaves are submerged in water. Succulent plants often have thick, juicy leaves, but some leaves are without major photosynthetic function and may be dead at maturity, as in some cataphyls and spines. Furthermore, several kinds of leaf-like structures found in vascular plants are not totally homologous with them. Examples include flattened plant stems called phylloclades and cladodes, and flattened leaf stems called phyllodes, which differ from leaves both in the structure and origin. Many structures of non-vascular plants, such as the phyllodes of mosses and liverworts and even of some foliose lichens, which are not plants at all, look and function much like leaves. General characteristics. Typically leaves are broad, flat and thin, at least in their early development, thereby maximizing the surface area directly exposed to light and enabling the light to penetrate the tissues and reach the chloroplasts, thus promoting photosynthesis. They are arranged on the plant so as to expose the surfaces to light as efficiently as possible without shading each other, but there are many exceptions and complications. For instance, plants adapted to windy conditions may have pendant leaves, such as in many willows and eucalypts, also conifers, whose leaves are needle-shaped. The flat, or laminar, shape also maximizes thermal contact with the surrounding air. The leaf shape also minimizes damage from wind by creating turbulence rather than resistance. Functionally, in addition to photosynthesis, the leaf is the principal site of transpiration and guttation. Leaves also function to store chemical energy and water and may become specialized organs serving other functions. The internal organization of most kinds of leaves has evolved to maximize exposure of the photosynthetic organelles, the chloroplasts, to light and to increase the absorption of carbon dioxide. The surfaces are waterproofed by the plant cuticle, and gas exchange between the mesophyll cells and the atmosphere is controlled by minute openings called stomata, about 10 micrometers, which open close to regulate the rate exchange of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water vapor into and out of the internal intercellular space system. Stomatal opening is controlled by the turgor pressure in a pair of guard cells that surround the stomatal aperture. In any square centimeter of a plant leaf there may be from 1,000 to 100,000 stomata. Many gymnosperms have thin needle-like or scale-like leaves that can be advantageous in cold climates with frequent snow and frost. These are interpreted as reduced from megaphylous leaves of the Devonian ancestors. Some leaf forms are adapted to modulate the amount of light they absorb to avoid or mitigate excessive heat, ultraviolet damage, or desiccation, or to sacrifice light absorption efficiency in favor of protection from herbivory. For xerophytes, the major constraint is not light flux or intensity, but route. Some window plants such as Fenestraria species and some Havathea species such as Havathea tessellata and Havathea truncata are examples of xerophytes and bulbine mesembryanthemoids. The shape and structure of leaves vary considerably from species to species of plant, depending largely on their adaptation to climate and available light, but also to other factors such as grazing animals, available nutrients, and ecological competition from other plants. Considerable changes in leaf type occur within species too. For example, as a plant matures, as a case in point, eucalyptus species commonly have isobilateral, pendant leaves when mature and dominating the neighbors. However, such trees tend to have erect or horizontal dorsiventral leaves as seedlings, when the growth is limited by the available light. Other factors include the need to balance water loss at high temperature and low humidity against the need to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide. In most plants, leaves also have the primary organs responsible for transpiration and guttation. Leaves can also store food and water, and are modified accordingly to meet these functions. For example, in the leaves of succulent plants and in bulb scales, the concentration of photosynthetic structures in leaves requires that they be richer in protein, minerals, and sugars than, say, woody stem tissues. Accordingly, leaves are prominent in the diet of many animals. Correspondingly, leaves represent heavy investment on the part of the plants bearing them, and the retention or disposition of the subject of elaborate strategies for dealing with pest pressures, seasonal conditions, and protective measures such as the growth of thorns and the production of phytoliths, lignans, tannins, and poisons. Deciduous plants in frigid or cold temperate regions typically shed the leaves in autumn, whereas in areas with a severe dry season, some plants may shed the leaves until the dry season ends. In either case, the shed leaves may be expected to contribute the retained nutrients to the soil where they fall. In contrast, many other non-seasonal plants, such as palms and conifers, retain the leaves for long periods, while which ear retains its two main leaves throughout a lifetime that may exceed 1,000 years. The leaf-like organs of bryophytes, known as phyllids, differ morphologically from the leaves of vascular plants in that they lack vascular tissue, are usually only a single cell thick, and have no cuticle stomata or internal system of intercellular spaces. Simple, vascularized leaves first evolved as enations, extensions of the stem, in club mosses such as Baragwanathea during the Silurian period. True leaves or euphylls of larger size and with more complex venation did not become widespread in other groups until the Devonian period, by which time the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere had dropped significantly. This occurred independently in several separate lineages of vascular plants, in progymnosperms like Archaeopteris, in Sphenopsida, ferns, and later in the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Euphylls are also referred to as macrophylls or megaphylls. Morphology. A structurally complete leaf of an angiosperm consists of a petiole, a lamina, and stipules. Not every species produces leaves with all of these structural components. In certain species, paired stipules are not obvious or are absent altogether. A petiole may be absent, or the blade may not be laminar. The tremendous variety shown in leaf structure from species to species is presented in detail below under morphology. The petiole mechanically links the leaf to the plant and provides the route for transfer of water and sugars to and from the leaf. The lamina is typically the location of the majority of photosynthesis. The upper angle between a leaf and a stem is known as the axil of the leaf. It is often the location of a bud. Structures located there are called axillary. External leaf characteristics, such as shape, margin, hairs, the petiole, and the presence of stipules, are important for identifying plant species, and botanists have developed a rich terminology for describing leaf characteristics. Leaves have determinate growth. They grow to a specific pattern and shape and then stop. Other plant parts like stems or roots have non-determinate growth, and will usually continue to grow as long as they have the resources to do so. The type of leaf is usually characteristic of a species, although some species produce more than one type of leaf. The longest leaves are those of the raffia palm, R. regalis, which may be up to 25 meters long and 3 meters wide. The terminology associated with the description of leaf morphology is presented in illustrated form at Wikibooks. Where leaves are basal and lie on the ground, they are referred to as prostrate. Basic leaf types ferns have fronds. Conifer leaves are typically needle or awl-shaped to scale-like. Angiosperm leaves, the standard form includes stipules, a petiole, and a lamina. Lycophytes have microfull leaves. Sheath leaves. Other specialized leaves. Arrangement on the stem. Different terms are usually used to describe the arrangement of leaves on the stem. Alternate leaf attachments are singular at nodes, and leaves alternate direction, to a greater or lesser degree, along the stem. Basal, arising from the base of the stem. Corline, arising from the aerial stem. Opposite two structures, one on each opposite side of the stem, typically leaves, branches, or flower parts. Leaf attachments are paired at each node and decussate if, as typical, each successive pair is rotated 90 degrees progressing along the stem. Whorled, or verticillate. 3 or more leaves attach at each point or node on the stem. As with opposite leaves, successive whorls may or may not be decussate, rotated by half the angle between the leaves in the whorl. Opposite leaves may appear whorled near the tip of the stem. Pseudo-verticillate describes an arrangement only appearing whorled, but not actually so. Rossulate leaves form a rosette. Rose. The term distichous literally means 2 rows. Leaves in this arrangement may be alternate or opposite in their attachment. The term 2-ranked is equivalent. The terms tristichous and tetrastichous are sometimes encountered. For example, the leaves of most species of Selaginella are tetrastichous, but not decussate. As a stem grows, leaves tend to appear arranged around the stem in a way that optimizes yield of light. In essence, leaves form a helix pattern centered around the stem, either clockwise or counterclockwise, with the same angle of divergence. There is a regularity in these angles, and they follow the numbers in a Fibonacci sequence: 1/2, 2/3, 3/5, 5/8, 8/13, 13/21, 21/34, 34/55, 55/89. This series tends to the golden angle, which is approximately 360 degrees times 34/89, approximately equals 137.52 degrees, approximately equals 137 degrees 30. In the series, the numerator indicates the number of complete turns or gyres until a leaf arrives at the initial position, and the denominator indicates the number of leaves in the arrangement. This can be demonstrated by the following. Alternate leaves have an angle of 180 degrees, 120 degrees. 3 leaves in one circle, 144 degrees. 5 leaves in 2 gyres, 135 degrees. 8 leaves in 3 gyres. Divisions of the blade. 2 basic forms of leaves can be described considering the way the blade is divided. A simple leaf has an undivided blade. However, the leaf shape may be formed of lobes, but the gaps between lobes do not reach to the main vein. A compound leaf has a fully subdivided blade, each leaflet of the blade being separated along a main or secondary vein. Because each leaflet can appear to be a simple leaf, it is important to recognize where the petiole occurs to identify compound leaf. Compound leaves are a characteristic of some families of higher plants, such as the Fabaceae. The middle vein of a compound leaf or a frond, when it is present, is called the rachis. Palmately compound leaves have the leaflets radiating from the end of the petiole, like fingers of the palm of a hand, e.g., cannabis and aesculus. Pinnately compound leaves have the leaflets arranged along the main or mid-vein. Odd pinnate with a terminal leaflet, e.g., fraxinus. Even pinnate, lacking a terminal leaflet, e.g., Swietenia. Bipinnately compound leaves are twice divided. The leaflets are arranged along a secondary vein that is one of several branching off the rachis. Each leaflet is called a pinnule. The group of pinnules on each secondary vein forms a pinna, e.g., albizia. Trifoliate a pinnate leaf with just 3 leaflets, e.g., trifolium laburnum. Pinnatifid pinnately dissected to the central vein, but with the leaflets not entirely separate, e.g., polypodium. Some sorbus. Impinnately veined leaves the central vein in known as the midrib. Characteristics of the petiole. Petiolated leaves have a petiole, and are said to be petiolate. Sessile leaves have no petiole and a blade attaches directly to the stem. Subpetiolate leaves are nearly petiolate, have an extremely short petiole and may appear to be sessile. In clasping a decurrent leaves, the blade partially surrounds the stem. When the leaf base completely surrounds the stem, the leaves are said to be perfoliate, such as in Claytonia perfoliata. Impeltate leaves, the petiole attaches to the blade inside the blade margin. In some acacia species, such as the KOA tree, the petioles are expanded or broadened and function like leaf blades. These are called phyllodes. There may or may not be normal pinnate leaves at the tip of the phylode. A stipule, present on the leaves of many dicotyledons, is an appendage on each side at the base of the petiole, resembling a small leaf. Stipules may be lasting and not be shed, or be shed as the leaf expands, leaving a stipule scar on the twig. The situation, arrangement, and structure of the stipules is called the stipulation. Free, lateral as in hibiscus, adnate fused of the petiole base, as in rosa, ochreate provided with ochrea or sheath-formed stipules, as in Polygonaceae, e.g., rhubarb, encircling the petiole base into petiola, between the petioles of 2 opposite leaves, as in Rubiaceae, intrapetiola between the petiole and the subtending stem, as in Malpighiaceae. Venation. There are 2 subtypes of venation, namely, crasptodromus, where the major veins stretch up to the margin of the leaf, and camptodromus, when major veins extend close to the margin, but bend before they intersect with the margin. Feather-veined reticulate. The veins arise pinnately from a single mid-vein and subdivide into veinlets. These, in turn, form a complicated network. This type of venation is typical for dicotyledons. Planovi 3 main veins branch at the base of the lamina and run essentially parallel subsequently, as in Ceanothus and in Celtis. A similar pattern is especially conspicuous in Melastomaticeae. Palmate netted, palmate veined, fan-veined. Several main veins diverge from near the leaf base where the petiole attaches, and radiate toward the edge of the leaf, e.g., most acer. Parallel-veined, parallel-ribbed, parallel-nerved. Penny-parallel veins run parallel for the length of the leaf, for the base to the apex. Commissural veins connect the major parallel veins. typical for most monocotyledons, such as grasses. Dichotomous, there are no dominant bundles, with the veins forking regularly by pairs, found in ginkgo and some pteridophytes. Although it is the more complex pattern, branching veins appear to be plesiomorphic and in some form were present in ancient seed plants as long as 250 million years ago. A pseudo-reticulate venation that is actually a highly modified penny-parallel one is an autapomorphy of some Melanithaceae, which are monocots, e.g. parasquadrophilia. Morphology changes within a single plant. Homoblasty, characteristic in which a plant has small changes in leaf size, shape, and growth habit between juvenile and adult stages. Heteroblasty, characteristic in which a plant has marked changes in leaf size, shape, and growth habit between juvenile and adult stages. Terminology: shape: edge tip acuminate, long pointed, prolonged into a narrow, tapering point in a concave manner. Acute, ending in a sharp, but not prolonged point. Cuspidate, with a sharp, elongated, rigid tip, tipped with a cusp. Emarginate, indented, with a shallow notch at the tip. Mucronate, abruptly tipped with a small short point, as a continuation of the midrib, tipped with a mucro. Mucronulate, mucronate, but with a noticeably diminutive spine. A mucronule. Obcordate, inversely heart-shaped, deeply notched at the top. Obtuse, rounded or blunt. Truncate, ending abruptly with a flat end that looks cut off. Base acuminate, coming to a sharp, narrow, prolonged point. Acute, coming to a sharp, but not prolonged point. Auriculate, ear-shaped. Cordate, heart-shaped with the notch towards the stalk. Cunate, wedge-shaped. Hastate, shaped like an halberdian with the basal lobes pointing outward. Oblique, slanting. Reniform, kidney-shaped but rounder and broader than long. Rounded, curving shape. Sagitta, shaped like an arrow hidden with the acute basal lobes pointing downward. Truncate, ending abruptly with a flat end that looks cut off. Surface coriaceous, leathery, stiff and tough, but somewhat flexible. Farinos, bearing farina, mealy, covered with a waxy, whitish powder. Glabrous, smooth, not hairy. Glaucous, with a whitish bloom, covered with a very fine, bluish-white powder. Glutinous, sticky, viscid. Lepidote, coated with small scales. Maculate, stained, spotted. Compare immaculate. Papillate, or papillose, bearing papillae. Pubescent, covered with erect hairs. Punctate, marked with dots, dotted with depressions, or with translucent glands or colored dots. Rugose, deeply wrinkled, with veins clearly visible. Scurfy, covered with tiny, broad scale-like particles. Tuberculate, covered with tubercles, covered with warty prominences. Verrucose, warted, with warty outgrowths. Viscid, or viscous, covered with thick, sticky secretions. The leaf surface is also host to a large variety of microorganisms. In this context it is referred to as the phyllosphere. Hairiness. Hairs on plants are properly called trichomes. Leaves can show several degrees of hairiness. The meaning of several of the following terms can overlap. Arachnoid, or arachnos, with many fine, entangled hairs giving a cobwebby appearance. Barbellate, with finely barbed hairs. Bearded, with long, stiff hairs. Bristly, with stiff hair like prickles. Canescent, hoary, with dense greyish-white pubescence. Ciliate, marginally fringed with short hairs. Ciliolate, minutely ciliate. Floccose, with flocks of soft, woolly hairs, which tend to rub off. Glabrescent, losing hairs with age. Glabrous, no hairs of any kind present. Glandular, with a gland at the tip of the hair. Hirsute, with rather rough or stiff hairs. Hispid, with rigid, bristly hairs. Hispidulous, minutely hispid. Hoary, with a fine, close greyish-white pubescence. Lanate, or lanos, with woolly hairs. Pilose, with soft, clearly separated hairs. Puberulent, or puberular, with fine, minute hairs. Pubescent, with soft, short and erect hairs. Scabrous or scabrid, rough to the touch. Cercious, silky appearance through a fine, straight or pressed hairs. Silky without pressed, soft and straight pubescence. Stellate or stelliform with star-shaped hairs. Strigose with oppressed, sharp, straight and stiff hairs. Tomentose densely pubescent with matted, soft white woolly hairs. Carnotomentose between canescent and tomentose. Felted tomentose woolly and matted with curly hairs. Tomentulose minutely or only slightly tomentose. Villous with long and soft hairs, usually curved. Woolly with long, soft and tortuous or matted hairs. Timing hysteranthus, developing after the flowers. Cynanthus, developing at the same time as the flowers. Vein patterning channel, sunken below the surface, resulting in a rounded channel size. The terms megaphyll, macrophyll, mesophyll, notophyll, microphyll, nanophyll and leptophyll are used to describe leaf sizes, in a classification devised in 1934 by Chris C. Raumkier and since modified by others.